So just to introduce myself, my name is Miriam Petra Ómarsdóttir Awad, and I am from Reykjavik, Iceland. I work at the Icelandic National Agency for Erasmus Plus, where I am the Inclusion and Diversity Officer, as well as the Eurodesk National Coordinator. And I previously used to be the Assistant e-Twinning Coordinator at the Icelandic National Agency. In my personal time, I'm also an anti-racist and cultural prejudice educator in Iceland. I go to schools and youth centers, and sometimes companies, and talk about anti-racism, or basically how racism and cultural prejudice appears in Icelandic society from an Icelandic perspective. My background is, I'm Icelandic. My mom is from the northwestern part of Iceland, from a small town called Bíldudalur, and my father was originally from Egypt. And so this interest in inclusion, diversity, and anti-racism comes naturally to me because of the experiences I've had in my personal life, being told not that I'm not Icelandic enough, or people just not simply believing me being Icelandic just because I'm not light-skinned enough, even though I feel quite pale right now in the midst of winter. But these experiences have colored my life, and in my master's degree, I studied, I did a research on the effects of racism and prejudice on the self-identities of Icelandic women with Middle Eastern backgrounds. So Icelandic women who are brought up in Iceland have one Icelandic parent and one Middle Eastern parent, and how prejudice and racism, like which kind of type of racism they are experiencing, and how it makes them feel. And I've just seen it from my personal perspective, and as well from doing this research, that racism is something that heavily affects people who are subject to it. They might start becoming more self-confident with age, and better, specifically if they have kind of gotten their footings in society and they have a good job and everything. Once they've grown up, they become more confident in their identities. But when you're young, this is very hard for most people, because you don't know what your future is going to be like. So this all influenced the fact that I'm here, and I'm working on both in my personal capacity and also in my professional career to work on this issue the best I can. And today I'm just going to bring up some questions and reflect on some questions on how anti-racism appears in Erasmus Plus, for example, through the priority of inclusion and diversity in the program, and how you can bring this into your projects, and to hopefully encourage you to have a discussion amongst yourselves on how this will look for you, and what you can do to include the anti-racist lens in your projects. So in a nutshell, the inclusion and diversity priority in Erasmus Plus is basically that everyone should be able to participate in Erasmus projects. The reality is that not everybody is involved or can be involved in regular projects that do not take inclusion and diversity into account. And the priority is basically now to reach people who are not being included automatically, so to say, into the projects by offering those who organize projects more tools to involve them. That is more financial support and also other themes, how to engage with inclusion. For example, the definitions of what can be who can have the inclusion support is quite broad. It's a lot broader than it used to be, and it's very good to get acquainted with all those categories of what is considered to be. I don't like to say people with fewer opportunities. I prefer to say people that just need some kind of inclusive support to be more automatically included, because just by standard they can feel excluded or are just not invited to participate in the projects, not because it's an intention, but because the way society is, that this doesn't normally account for their participation. The role of anti-racism in this context is to be aware of the effects of racism on people participating in projects. So because there is racism embedded in our societal structure, it does automatically affect both pupils and staff who participate in projects. And it is therefore very vital that we are aware and practicing anti-racism so that our projects can become more inclusive for those groups of people who are experiencing racism in societies. Because racism that exists in society will not leave at the door when the project is entered, when you enter the project. So you will have to be aware of these things in the program. And the program can serve as a very good tool to combat racism, because inherently Erasmus projects are about mobility and are about getting to know other countries and cultures. And in that way, we can use it as a good tool to open up people's minds. And I think it's an untapped resource to have this inclusive support in the program. And when we are fighting racism, we can actually embed it more in our projects. And I think that's why anti-racism in education is very important, and to bring it into Erasmus projects would be to benefit. It would be beneficial for a lot of people who normally would feel excluded because of their personal experiences with racism. I think everyone needs to learn new skills when it comes to a topic such as anti-racism, and I think it's completely normal to have to learn new skills regarding this, because this is not something we are automatically trained on. Even people who are subject to racism are not even trained to have the vocabulary to explain their experiences. So you can, of course, not expect everyone else to know exactly the ins and outs of how to be an anti-racist. So this, of course, there is a lot of skills to be learned and a lot of things to be learned. But I think it is I think people have to also give themselves the time to learn them and put in the effort as well, because racism is something that really deeply affects parts of populations in our countries. And it is for the society's entire benefit that we are all aware of these things. So putting in an effort that is very minimal if you compare it to the strain and suffering of those who are subject to racism is maybe, I guess, a moral duty for all of us to do. And once it becomes something you've learned, you're never going to forget it. So it's something that you put in an effort to learn and become better at, and it will be with you for the rest of your life. It's not something you will forget easily. If you have become anti-racist once, you're continually building on top of it. So I think it's definitely a skill that teachers will have to learn and add in their toolbox, but I think it's something that will equip them very well and be something that will be useful for them for years to come. Nobody says like, I don't want to be inclusive, but then we are accidentally very often exclusive because we don't know the realities of the people who are living the exclusion. And we don't know how to put ourselves in their shoes because we don't have the same lived experiences. And for young people who are of racial minorities or subject to some kind of racism or cultural prejudice, there's a lot of feelings of like maybe not being worth it or worthy enough, like their fellow students who are in the majority groups, because they see around themselves that they are in a minority, and sometimes if they are in a minority and they're experiencing perhaps some kind of racism out in society or even within the school walls, they won't seek participation as actively as other students. For example, if you offer a student group to go on an Erasmus project, you might feel that the ones who are subject to racism are just not interested, but they're probably interested, but they just don't know if it's for them. They just they assume very often that, oh, this is for the ones who are of the local background. This is not for people like me, because very many things are kind of told subconsciously to them that they are not for them because they don't fit in. Or even though everybody wants them to fit in, it's just kind of the way our societies are structured. You get all these ideas from, the movies and, who is in charge and power. And if you don't see yourself reflected in those, you just think that, oh, I can't become one of it. And the same goes with projects. So if you always see a same group of students going on these projects, you will just automatically assume that it's not for people like me. I would say at least that it's kind of threefold. It is like the context or the content of the project. Just being aware, like, is there anything in the project's content that you're choosing, like the materials or something? Is there anything in there that is perpetuating racial stereotypes, or are you using outdated teaching materials that maybe have, like language that is, that is derogatory to certain groups? Just be aware of that, because I mean, we see it still happening here, at least, that there are books that are being used that have old-fashioned language that we wouldn't accept in our way of speaking anymore, but we're still kind of using these books as a teaching material. Maybe be considerate of that, and the images that are being picked for any material, selected or in the project, just so that they're not perpetuating stereotypes. There's also, if you're bringing the students abroad, are you aware of the situation in the country that you're bringing them? Do you have a young person in your group who is from a racial minority? Would you know how to tackle it with your Erasmus partner or your colleagues if something comes up while you're traveling? Because we have heard of incidents like that when groups of students are brought to another country and then they just don't feel safe there because there's a different standard to behaviors that we maybe might be used to at home, or maybe from the other group of students. Like, how would you tackle it if something comes up in there? And thirdly, like I was saying, I have said earlier, how are we selecting the students when it comes to participating in the project? For example, are they supposed to all have finished, an assignment in the local language, but who maybe there's a group of students who don't speak the language fluently? Do we have specific criteria that they can try to achieve to be selected, so that they are not left out just because they don't speak the language, for example? Or are we reaching out to the students in a different way because we don't know if they automatically think that they should be applying? So there's three things I think are quite important to take a look at when organizing an eTwinning or Erasmus Plus project. With the eTwinning aspect, of course, there might not be any travel involved, but still, how are students interacting with the other students online, if they are? And how are they presented the materials that they are working with, and who is just making sure that nobody's feeling left out in the process. And of course, there's can also be this aspect, because I know a lot of eTwinning projects, which are excellent projects, work on sharing cultures. And when we're sharing cultures, do we allow for the ones who are of another cultural background to share their kind of side of their culture within that context? Or are we only sharing the cultures of the countries that are participating in the project? Or do we allow for some more diversity to show that there is diversity within the group? Because this can be empowering as well for the students if they are interested in doing that. Some of them might not, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. In this context, it's always, I mean, it's understandable to go for something that you are comfortable with and acquainted with, but I think it's always beneficial to add maybe another element or another country that you've never worked with, so that, just to get to widen the horizon a little bit and get new perspectives, because sometimes things don't appear as obvious as a benefit as they could be. And perspectives that you can gain from working with further away countries, I think it would be useful. And also, if you're working with a diverse group of students, partnering up with doing a project with another group that is diverse as well could be very empowering for them to see that there are young people like them as well. And also for the local students to get the glimpse into a very diverse classroom somewhere else just to see that the diversity is something that is normal in other places than just where they are. And even if they are not in a very diverse classroom, I think it's also very good for them to see diversity in the projects that they're doing at school, so that diversity is not something that is unusual. Diversity is something that only exists out of the school context, like to get them to experience diversity, like this diversity inside a school context for those who maybe live in rural areas or there are not a lot of diversity, that it's good for them as well to see that, oh yeah, this is something that is completely normal, just so that just to break down this kind of barrier or even like fear that people might have of diversity. So I think everyone has naturally a different entry point into this topic. For example, for people who have experienced some kind of exclusion, their entry point could, for example, being to take a look at their feeling of like what their experiences with exclusion has been, to kind of put themselves in the shoes of being perpetually excluded just based on your skin color. For people who have some kind of racial minority or actually experienced racism, their entry point will be different because they will base it on their personal experiences. So of course we have a different entry point, and it is quite good to start by kind of identifying where in the racial power structure you kind of fit, because knowing your privileges in this context is also good, and it says nothing about you as a person. You're a good person even though you might have privileges in this context. It's not something you control, but it automatically affects your life. So you might want to look into that and have that as an entry point and see how this kind of system of racism is affecting other people around you. And going into it from that direction can kind of bring in this kind of personal aspect. You're not learning it for them, you're also learning it for yourself, so that you know how this structure is affecting all of our societies and the school system as well. I think it can be a challenge often in schools to kind of get everyone on board in this way of thinking, because often people who are not experiencing this on their own skin, they just don't think that it is something that everybody should be talking about. And then it just becomes the problem of those who are subject to racism. They're the ones who always have to kind of bring it out, talk about it, and it becomes like a mental burden. So I think by kind of starting the conversation and showing that we can all, we are basically all striving for a better society, no matter what context it comes from. It's even if we're talking about gender equality, disability rights, LGBTQI rights, anti-racism should be there as well, because it's just one aspect of excluding people automatically in the way our society functions, and we can stop that exclusion from happening, because the exclusion itself is a detrimental element in the societies where it makes people feel either unwanted, unneeded, or just angry. And when we have people feeling like that, depressed or angry, you start having more of societal problems than if you would eliminate the factors that exclude them. So starting in schools is, of course, a great place to start. And having worked with young people, done presentations on the topic to pupils, it often comes up in the conversations with them that often it is within the schools that they feel unsafe, because this is their main way of interacting with society. They're too young to kind of go out in society at large to interact with it as we do as adults. So their main interactions with other adults comes through school. And if the teachers are perpetuating racial stereotypes, either by upholding them or not saying anything when somebody else does, it ultimately affects students. And so they have often mentioned that they would feel that the teachers need to get more trained on anti-racism. And I think when you start this kind of movement and encouragement and this kind of positive reinforcement of that this is something that is beneficial for all of us, you could get further than if you are kind of just creating a checklist that everybody has to follow, and then some people will just kind of like not want to, or they don't see the need for it. And I think in order to achieve this, there needs to be training, presentations, or workshops dedicated to the topic, like you're doing right now, but on a broader level. So within each school, it would be ideal if there was some kind of time dedicated to this topic, just so that they are aware, the teachers and staff are aware of the ways these way racism appears within the school life, in the teaching materials, and in the way we speak to each other, and how we can tackle it from all the different sides. Working with anti-racism is inherently uncomfortable because we always want to believe that our societies are good and that they're striving to do good, which most of us we are just striving to be better every day. So it can be hard to hear the fact that something that we are doing is automatically it's not good, but it just comes from the fact that we have learned historically, or we have never challenged these ideas, or we learn them from the media today. And we are like sponges for all of the information that we get, so we kind of automatically learn a set of prejudice that we might not even want to have, or we think we don't have, but then we automatically kind of act on this. So being called out, even if it's ourselves, the school structure, the society itself, being called out is inherently uncomfortable because people don't really want to face it or take the conversation, or they just don't feel that they know how. And my advice on this would be to kind of embrace the uncomfortableness of it all, because racism is not comfortable for those who experience it. It shouldn't be comfortable for us to tackle it. It is going to be a bit of a, it's going to be like overturning a set of beliefs or way of speaking or way of seeing the world, from this kind of positive rose-tinted colored lens that we've had, and that is uncomfortable, and it just kind of has to be. But the reward is more comfortable when you start seeing the benefits of tackling racism. You realize that the uncomfortableness of it all is worth it, and it is a lot less uncomfortable than actually experiencing racism. And it should be our collective burden to kind of work on it, to kind of alleviate that from the ones who are suffering from racism by doing in a little bit of the effort that might be uncomfortable. Now, sometimes situations come up that we don't have the toolbox to tackle because we haven't been trained on it. And I would always advise that you identify someone in your country or in the close surroundings of where you work who is working on this topic. There are a lot of people, and I think I can safely say in every country you will have some kind of anti-racism expert. And I would reach out to them, or use, even find the social media accounts that kind of highlight anti-racism in teaching, because I know there are a few. When those incidents come up that are uncomfortable to tackle, it's very hard to tackle them alone. And often, to kind of diffuse the situation, it is good to get an outsider perspective. And I would encourage you to kind of map out who you could contact, because we have a lot of policies in place on how to tackle, for example, bullying, sexual harassment, and etc. But we might not have something in place already for racism. And while it is like that, we need to kind of get the help from outside in order to tackle these situations when they come up with the kind of proper means, because we're not naturally born with the toolbox. We have to kind of learn it, and we'll learn it from discussing it with the experts as well. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to come to this seminar. I'm very happy to know that you are there, because that just shows your ambition for this topic, which is very dear to me. And I would just encourage you to kind of keep on going, not be discouraged by the uncomfortableness of it all. See that you have buddies who want to be allies. Just look around you and see that you have, at least, even if you go back home and there's maybe no one around you at first that knows the topic, you can always contact your colleagues from the workshop. You'll have someone there that you can, relate with. You've all gone through this seminar together, and hopefully you'll bring something back home that you can expand on further. And yeah, just thank you for listening, and I hope this has been useful to you.